because also the moment that you're getting sort of exhausted and anxious is also the moment that we are seeing what's going on in the school very clearly for the first time. So actually, we're kind of feeling happy. So in that sort of happy moment, we exchange thoughts, and in so doing, in a way, continue a long tradition of the Architectural Association in London and the GSAPP in New York being sister schools for many reasons, but one of the most obvious that I inherited the school from Bernard, who inherited his thinking from Alvin Borowski in London, and in Bernard's early years here, when he was basically importing the AA model of kind of experimental publications and attitudes and so on. Alvin remained a very important mentor on kind of key questions in terms of, and so quite often actually Bernard and Alvin would get together to talk about, you know, education, where it was going and what it was doing, and the same was true for me when I took over the school here, that Bernard was the person that I could talk about these kinds of things. So there is this sort of AA GSAPP link, which is obvious in so many ways. Less obvious. One of the reasons the two schools remain linked is that they are by far and away the most global, by sort of ambition, by operation, by reflection, and so on. This also goes back to Alvin Borowski, who was really created the first school that was not very different from an airport. And the relationship between the AA and Heathrow is very similar to the relationship between this school and JFK. And in the middle of all of this sort of excessive global whatever, Brett and I were very interested in the neglected nylon axis, the horizontal axis. You could say in all of our enthusiasm for South-South relationships, we sort of yearned again to sort of play that one string, that horizontal string that links London and New York, the old North-North. And of course, to finish, maybe this is my beginning of my part of the conversation, of course, New York is not America. As you know, I love the fact that it's really close to America. It's a good place to see America from, and it's a good way to stay away from America. New Jersey is as close as America came to New York, and then it said, oh, I don't want any part of that. And of course, famously, London and England is not really Europe either, and it's actually formally not Europe. So London has a very particular observation position relative to Europe, and New York has a particular observation position relative to the Americas. So that link, that kind of North-North link, is not an American-European link, but is in a way a link between two islands, quite literally Manhattan and British Isles, and therefore it's a kind of seeing what one could see from this horizontal axis. Independently of all of that, Brett's really a wonderful. That's great. Is a wonderful friend and has done an extraordinary creative. Has played an incredibly creative role in being the kind of Alvin of our time in London, and it's always just super nice that he's here. He's, by the way, annoyingly fit at this moment. So if you think he's looking good, is totally unacceptable. Alvin never, ever looked good, never worked out, never ran on the beach. So there is some sort of annoying tendency here that I am determined to stamp out. But Brett, you're so welcome again.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank. Thank you. That's it. The talk is done now. There's no way I can live up to the introduction. Since we redesigned the weather in London, things are just much easier there now than they used to be. This is, by my count, the fifth of these kind of public versions of conversations that we've been having in various ways and in many different venues, not just at our home schools, over the last few years. And in some ways, it kind of brings to a closure a cycle of topics that we've been working on together, not just in the work that we've been doing in our schools here and in London, but also for a longer period of time. So I'd like to begin first by absolutely thanking Mark for an introduction that will far surpass what I have to offer as part of the conversation. In fact, this topic of exchange between New York and London, which is the sort of formal rubric for this series, and the idea of re-invoking a sort of Silk Road today in rampant multi-directional globalization, isn't something that just can explain the shared DNA between our two schools, but I think many of our personal biographies as both students and educators. I happened to do my graduate work here in this city about the time Mark arrived in the 1980s, but of course did it downtown in the East Village, which was just a great seminar room in places like the Pyramid Club and others, which I think really taught me the sort of lessons that I've always, for schools, argued are the models by which learning and ideas can circulate in ways that really do matter, which would be the short version of one of our topics we've worked on over the last few years, which is the ways in which schools like this, great experimental schools, have as an obligation and a brief the making of audiences much more than the making of architects. I think the great failure of nearly every school of architecture in the world is the obsession with how they produce architects, and I think in a world like ours, which is populated by hundreds of thousands of those species, that what becomes much more interesting is the way in which the architect as a figure doesn't just learn, but grows and flourishes with an understanding that he or she is fundamentally carrying forward the ideas of architecture in relation to many different kinds of audiences that you all will, throughout your careers, become incredibly comfortable with moving between. So, Mark, thank you for the series. In a way, he is my audience as much as the rest of the people in this room, and I continue to have learned a huge amount from the conversations. Mark and I are the latest descendants of a figure named Walter Gropius, who is, you could say, the father of modern experimental architectural schools. Mark and I have now surpassed in our tenure Walter's own tenure at Dessau. He only lasted 7 years before the students of his school threw him out in a petition that was generated by students that had to do with his failure to teach architectural history, which I always found incredibly ironic. And in 1926, his students led a revolt that quickly found him moving elsewhere for the remainder of his career. The four Walters are the models of Walters that I think Mark is an absolute master of invoking. The idea that a teacher and a school leader is at once a benevolent kind of dictator, is almost always on the road. In fact, in ways today probably unlike many of our predecessors, in imagining what happens when schools like this operate throughout the world, as he has just done masterfully in his introduction for this short presentation, is always a kind of host to the bringing together of different visitors. And of course, in the end, what we really always hope is ultimately that we're much more like Andy Warhol and sitting in the middle of a studio where our only real job is coordinating the activities of all the real talent in the room and trying to understand how we can connect people together in different ways. I think I've continued over the last several years to have learned from Mark's mastery of those abilities in many ways, and tonight will just be another opportunity for me to do that. This is the identity that was recently created by some friends in London for us around this rubric, this idea of New York, London being thought of together as two sides of the same coin or conjoined twins in some way. These conversations are just 4 or 5 examples of, I think, many ways in which you can see how the trafficking of ideas between New York and London, and it very much being a two-directional traffic, still matters, I think, immensely in the world and the culture of architecture today. That identity, by the way, was created by this young fellow in this picture. He's my art director, Zach Keyes, who put this slide up. And sorry, it's a bad screenshot. Somebody just sent me overnight, but it's a poster that we made a few years ago when the AA invited Le Corbusier to Bedford Square for the first time in the late 1940s. This was Corb's opening 2 sentences for that night's speech, which was that he would absolutely not talk about architecture. And of course, he then spent 2 hours doing nothing but talking about architecture in himself. And in a way, I think it's part of the inspiration for what this kind of a conversation has been between Mark and I the last few years here and in London and some of the other settings. That, in a way, what we're interested in is architecture and architectural cultures and the role that schools today can play in the shaping of what we think of as architectural culture. The short version of my story is that the dominant technology in architectural culture today is the technology of the architectural school. And there are many reasons why that's the case, but a school, like any institution, is a kind of artificial organization that's been created for certain purposes. It has evolved over its 150-year history from the 1840s and 1850s, when literally a school like the AA was created, or the École was formed in Paris. And over that 150 years, the school as we know it has evolved in many new and unexpected ways. What has become interesting in that project isn't just the ways in which that model of the school is now being superseded by other forms of learning and thinking, which poses a great challenge to all of us here, as it does for us back in the school in London and many places, but increasingly how the models of technology we have are themselves evolving, and in fact the great possibility within schools is that they may yet return to their greatest potential, which you could say is its ability, a school's ability to operate as a disruptive technology, i.e. to see as its primary project the disrupting of known architectural habits, practices, theories, ideas, histories, as the means by which to produce and disseminate architectural knowledge to audiences around the world. And that's really the backdrop, as I see it, for these conversations. What I did for this talk tonight is as much for Mark and my reminder as anyone, but is to just show you some of the topics that we've organized these conferences and roundtables around. This first one was held on the 24th of February in 2010. Our topic that evening was futures and the extraordinary degree to which architects are unable to realize the worlds they draw. And when you look at projects like this one here in this city and the ambitions in 1930s of what the modern city would become, one of the great ironies of the discipline of architecture is its almost instinctive dependence upon future change as giving us a reason for working, i.e. if the world was fine as it is, in fact we wouldn't have a brief to go build a building or to change cities, but that in architects' attempt to try and bring vision to that project, they almost inevitably fail in their imagery. So if you look at the New York World Expo in the 1930s, the techno-utopianism of the 1960s by Archigram or others, if you look at the paintings of Zaha's Peak Project in 1983, et cetera, what you see are projects that are imagining a future with incredible precision, resolution, and clarity, but which almost always are dramatically different than the world as it's eventually realized, even by some of those architects in their own careers. Later that year, in autumn of 2010, Mark and I shifted to the topic of schools and how the physical, spatial organization of schools can be shown to have evolved dramatically over the last 100 years. The one picture I've got to remind us of that conversation is an event we did here, and I know you all will have done something very similar in different parts of New York, but an evening in which we hung a cloth under Lord Foster's bridge, Millennium Bridge in London, smuggled in videotapes of Rayner Banham's lectures in Los Angeles, did a 6-hour social media campaign around the city, and found audiences gathering opposite Rennes Cathedral. And what we are able to witness is, of course, the ways in which the school as we know it are literally breaking the boundaries of the walls or the floors or the studios that we all have taken for granted as our refuge over the last century. Schools today are everywhere in many different ways, just as the productive spaces of the studios are. In 2011, we reconvened on the topic of failure, which is one of my favorite topics in architecture, the stunning extent to which failure is avoided in our discussion of what architects do and how they operate. Mark and I presented some of the background material to a project we originally tried to create in the late 1980s called the Institute of Failure, which had as its grand ambition in a small studio space here in New York, the teaching to students of how to fail spectacularly in architecture. Our attempt to launch the school also failed. We couldn't attract any students. We had one applicant who ended up going to Princeton. And of course, the great revenge in that, and this was reported in Progressive Architecture, one of the magazines at the time, was of course we then went on to become the heads of 2 very successful schools. somehow proving that we were all wrong in it. By the way, the graphic that I showed in this audience a few years ago when we did that was this moment in time that I'm projecting when you all here at GSAPP will have to decide whether or not to accept a disembodied network who makes an application to the school, and when you all will be joined in this room by the forms of intelligence and network processing that will make that a reality, by my reckoning, about 2 or 3 deans away from our current tenure here at the school. That's the backdrop to tonight's talk. The last one that we did following failure was on the topic of pathways, which Mark has already hinted at, which is this idea of what it might mean for there to still be major hubs or nodes within architectural culture that operate or by necessity need to operate in ways that might be different than some of the other points in today's global networks of knowledge, learning, and practice. And the picture I'm showing here is of the Trojan horse of these machines, which a few years ago arrived in the new electronic amplified studio, which was a topic of great discussion and interest for a few short years. The idea of a sort of digital studio, it was called. I can't remember. Was it paperless studio here? Yeah. Is it still called that? No. Yeah. We're past that point. Anyway, it was even in places like this. The computer seemed a novelty. In fact, it seemed to be quite a disruptive technology originally, but of course what became far more interesting in it over the last 10 to 15 years is all this stuff that sits behind computers. In fact, the wholesale delivery of highly machinic, highly automated, connective technologies which allow the figure we call the architect to now operate not just alongside his or her teammates and teachers and clients and collaborators and audiences and inhabitants in new and unexpected ways, but that provide us almost a completely different kind of model for what the school itself is today, as a kind of network of learning and information. So tonight's talk, for the exchange that will take place in a minute, I've suggested might be the topic of realities. Not a reality in the world today, but that one of the, I think, most interesting features of the architectural world as we know it today is that reality is that there's almost a kind of contemporary obsession with solving the problems, the real problems as we know them today. I have, and it's probably not a surprise, a sort of counter view to that belief that architects' jobs are the solving of real problems in the world. I think our job is forever to invent new kinds of problems and make them more interesting than the old problems. The advice I always offer young architects is don't waste your career trying to solve the problems created by old architects. Create your own. And I think for this generation today that's struggling with this kind of reality, this is a photograph I took a couple of years ago at our Dubai school. I looked out from the studio we were working in to see this sort of backdrop of a city that's now younger than the average age of its inhabitants. You know, a kind of category of problem that even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, most of us couldn't have even imagined as a problem or a project. That a huge amount of time and energy is being spent today by schools trying to imagine their job as an institution is solving the problems posed by this sort of condition. It's a huge project. It's a difficult project, and it's not one that I want to say we'll be ignoring, but that what you all need to do as architects and theorists and writers, as publishers, as artists, any kind of figure that's working in the realm of cultural production, is to invent the kind of anti-realities, new realities, by which we can see this world we know in new and unexpected ways. I think there's been a huge collapse within architectural culture regarding a belief in the creating of alternative futures. The idea of a future visionary project today is almost unimaginable in most settings, while we all run around trying to solve the problems of delivering projects of this kind of scale. And my inspiration for setting tonight's topic with realism is also the passing last Thursday of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great magical realist, you could say, who provided a model for many of us for many, many decades of what it means to really try and invent new descriptions of the world that everybody knows through its habits and ideas. He wrote this, Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote this in the 1980s when he was awarded a Nobel Prize. We, the inventors of tales who will believe anything, feel entitled to believe that it is not yet too late to engage in the creation of the opposite utopia. A new and sweeping utopia of life where no one will be able to decide for others how they die, where love will prove true and happiness be possible, and where the races condemned to 100 years of solitude will have, at last and forever, a second opportunity on Earth. And I think you all will probably know Marquez's astonishing novels and the way in which they mix the fictional or the imaginary with a sort of finely grained description of the world that we know around us. But, you know, what he's argued for throughout his career is that your job as an artist is to redescribe that world as already known in new and unexpected ways. And for me, however much that's a kind of literary genre now, magical realism is a subculture within a larger project of the contemporary novel, that nonetheless this deliberate mixing of the real with the fictional, the invented with the found, is in some ways a kind of counter description of what architectural life itself always is, right? And the architects, ironically, don't make real things. None of us ever do go out and build the city that we know in the pictures, right? What we make are those images, those models, those drawings, those texts, which, as Robin Evans once described, it becomes a means of translation between a world in our head and the world out there that someone is going to realize. It is an entirely fictional discipline, right? Which is maybe one way to explain why architects can get so spectacularly wrong their vision of what the future might be. And rather than seeing that as a failure, I think what I'd be supporting, I guess, in a conversation we might have now are the ways in which we can return to a willing acknowledgement of that sort of unreal dimension of the work that we do in the pursuit of architecture. A return to a kind of visionary project today in architecture, I think, is one of the great, almost unfathomable challenges for us. In a world in which there is simply so much pressure being put on a younger generation today to deliver this kind of building, right? This scale, this wave of human achievement, which all architects are pointing to, is, I think, coming at the cost of architects finding a way to stand back and create a space in which they can speculate on alternative, what Marquez might call here, alternative utopias to the sort of realities that we're all living in. As Aeneas Nin wrote in Henry and June, the monster I kill every day is the monster of realism. And there's a sort of subtext within the modern project over the last 100 years which sees anti-realism, which sees an escape from the real world we know, not as an escape or a denial of all of the problems in front of us, but as the task of an artist, right? As our job, in effect. One of the things that an architect, like other artists, can do is speculate on a future for the sheer opportunity that provides other minds or other audiences to think about what architecture might yet become. J.G. Ballard, a couple of years ago, soon before he died, said, "Put a higher value on yourself. Being hyper-realistic about everything is simply a cop-out in your work as an artist." I've got one or two paragraphs here, and I'll just close with these maybe from this. One of them is an opening to a piece I've written recently on architectural anti-realism, and because it points to architectural schools, maybe it's a way to close it here. Architectural schools have largely surrendered themselves to the various, largely unconvincing realities equated with the present, the everyday here and now. Architectural schools no longer devote themselves to the making of genuinely experimental and visionary projects that invent new kinds of knowledge through an unbelievably compelling description of possible future worlds. That's what important architecture and great experimental schools should be all about, and that's what schools, I think, like this one and my school, small school back in London, remain committed to. In these early years of the 21st century, architectural schools have allowed a contemporary fascination with the present to become the primary means to explain and largely explain away a loss of architecture's core disciplinary project, the making of previously unimagined, sometimes even unexpected, harsh, and untested alternative futures. And I've been thinking of this really by looking back through our archives. I'm just going to close with one or two final images here, because we've been working on this project in various ways, but this is by coincidence an image of a drawing by my teacher, my teacher's classmate's assistant, and their student, who was the teacher of my teacher when I came to the EA in the 1980s. A nice closed circle of conspiracy. But of course, what's so striking about it at this sort of stage in late modern architectural culture is an absolute comfort with the idea of making the unexpected or the unknown. And having recently had a conversation with Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano about that image in the upper left, which is done 9 years after Richard graduates from the AA in 1960, and which is itself completely deconstructed for the museum we know now in Paris. I think one of the striking things was the sort of generational instinct at that time for the task of the architect as being aimed towards the future. That's arguably an immensely more challenging project today, but I think it's challenging not because we can't imagine those futures, but simply because of the scale of this sort of a project sitting on everybody's table today. The delivery of more urbanism, more buildings, more landscapes, more space than the history of humanity is planned for the next 35 years. I have graduate students who will graduate this year in London, like they will do here, like some of you are going to do next month, and over the next 30 years, more stuff is going to be built than the history of our species has ever imagined. Like, the last thing you all need to worry about is what you're going to do. Right? I mean, getting a job isn't the project. Delivering projects, in fact, at an almost astonishing scale and speed, is a different kind of project, and it's one that I think is going to create real questions or real challenges about how it's possible to stand outside of that force, that sheer force of delivery, so that alternative futures or ideas might be imagined. That is that generation. This is a photograph that was taken of at my final presentation as a student at the AA in the 1980s by members of that generation who were interested in one thing only, where architecture was going and not what it's described as now. I don't know if you can recognize everyone here, some obvious faces. Cedric looking incredibly serious as always. Terrifying guy. My teacher over on the right, who you'll know because he's taught here recently. In the background is Mark Fisher, who sadly passed away last year and spent his entire architectural career working for Mick Jagger and anybody but people that he thought were serious about what architecture should be and where it's going. That's Mark scribbling in his notebook. This is a few years after he launched his career by inflating a pig over Battersea Power Station for Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd had been in the AA for the end of year party, and Mark introduced himself to Nick Mason and the band and decided, of course, there was an alternative career that would lie in working for these kind of characters, and of course he famously invents the idea of modern rock and roll stadium architecture. But what's interesting is that that was a career that simply never looked back. Mark took a leap, you know, sort of ran with it, and up until his final hours last year spent his time imagining an architectural world that he said would never be fulfilled. I'm just going to close with these last couple of pictures, which is a series that was just sent to me overnight. It's another way to think about, I think, a context for this idea of an unreal architecture, which ironically we're now trying to realize 100 years later. These are taken in the Giardini in Venice over the weekend for this one-to-one copy of this project, which turns 100 next autumn, and for that reason will be the basis for a worldwide birthday party we're throwing for Maison Domino, but which really begs the question, I think, better than anything we could possibly do today about the ways in which we might reinvest ourselves in a project that's all about imagining an alternative future, and almost with the belief that its unrealized status will matter as much as whatever it is that we understand and discover in the making of it. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark.
The spirit of these things is kind of like fireside chats, you know. And like trying to avoid the annoying feeling for you of people continuing a conversation that goes on without you, as if it's sort of interesting. And I think there are two sides of it. One is just a sort of comparing notes about what we're up to and where the world is going. But the other is let's say the kind of mission of trying to decide what is the role of the architect in contemporary society, and therefore what is the role of an architectural school, and therefore what would be the role of events like this. And I think that one way that I'm interested in some of the things that you said that I would have said, but using slightly different language. So I'm interested in sort of testing if we're saying the same thing. But one version would be that there is well, historically, the Architectural Association is the oldest school, I think, in England, no? And the guy that founded this school was the first person to found a school of architecture in the university. So they're kind of schools at the beginnings of what becomes systems of education. And there are certain theories at work in those schools. The theory here is to do with the research university, that the research university, as developed by the Germans, and threatens the world for that reason, suggests for the first time that the place of the university is to develop new forms of knowledge as distinct from protect ancient forms of knowledge. So instead of arguing about how many angels could fit on the head of a pin, you actually design a superior pin, or preferably a military device. And so the key mechanism for that is the laboratory. So that in the laboratory, you could test propositions about the world that were not necessarily worldly. They were crazy by definition, but protected within the space of the laboratory. And if some of those tests worked out, and failure would be the main engine of these spaces, those ideas could then be deployed in the world. The United States formed the land-grant colleges, of which MIT was the first, because it was incredibly nervous about the thought that the Germans would develop weapons using this technology. Because if knowledge is no longer reflection about the world, but was a form of changing the world, then surely the best minds could develop literally mechanisms for changing the world, killing people and so on. Not by chance then, MIT in Boston was the first of the land-grant colleges. And not by chance, MIT very quickly became the center of the American weapons industry. And the guy that forms this school sets up the first school of architecture in MIT using the language of the laboratory. So he says, hey, maybe you didn't think about this, but an architecture school would be a really good idea. Architecture is half science, half art. You guys are scientists, so you've already covered half our curriculum. By the way, the art side, it's a bit weird and is undiscovered, so we would have to do research on that. So we would just need the technology of the library and the archive and photography, and we could graft ourselves into your university. And by the way, if you were to do this and were wondering who would be a good person to be the director of that school, I have somebody in mind, myself. And so William Ware, who was an architect based in New York and trained in Europe like everybody else in the École des Beaux-Arts, became the director of the first school of architecture at MIT, and then Columbia stole him to New York like just a few years later. The reason I say all of this is this idea that crazy things happen in the laboratory, which after being proven move out into the world, presupposes that the inside of a university could be crazier than the outside. And my way of translating what you're saying is that actually in today's environment, the world itself is considerably more crazy than any laboratory, or let's say Dubai is part of the biggest experiment that the planet has ever seen. Certainly the fact that more than 50% of the world's new buildings every year are built in China means that statistically China is normal and everything else is weird. Right? So the West, even the South, is weird. So in that environment, what does a school of architecture do? You could use the old model, which is, let's say, the Alvin model of the kind of crazy experimental laboratory, the unit system, where you join a sect, a cult, and I love this idea of yours of a kind of magical realism, a kind of sort of quixotic environment within which ideas are pursued that may or may not have relevance. And of course that incredibly brilliant history of the AA shows that people teaching those studios and people in those studios really have made an incredibly dramatic impact on the world. So one could argue that the model still held, the laboratory model, and the AA, I think, kind of pioneers the sort of, laboratory being also in the sense of an artist studio, pioneers that model which is then exported or imported here in New York. But now I think we have this other question, which, okay, what happens when the outside world is weirder than we are? Like, there's nothing any architecture student at Columbia could invent which is weird relative to the world. And then to combine that thought with an almost sort of shocking reality, I think, which is if architectural teachers say what it is that they love about studio, and actually almost everywhere in the world everybody says the same thing. Like, so it could be that the Architectural Association in London and GSAPP take seriously the idea of the studio as a laboratory. So you have an entire school shaped on the image of studio. So instead of studio just being in the afternoon, you have a whole school that has the ethos of an experimental studio. Now, every teacher of architecture, everywhere you go in the world, will say, studio, it's amazing. It's not clear what the problem is or what the solution is. It's multi-dimensional, it's synthetic, it's collaborative, it's a lab, there's a great intimacy between teacher and student, there's a moment in which the students have to become teachers. All this talk, which is true, and it's also what is amazing about studio. There's nothing considered off limits within the space of the studio, anything's possible, all of this. This is increasingly exactly the same description that scientists make of their ideal educational environment. So if you want to study the brain or genetics or cancer or whatever, you say, I need a space in which there's collaborative thinking, multidimensional, anything's possible, teamwork, etc., etc. But it's more than that. This image is also the kind of image of the creative economy. So a large part of the kind of management of cities is using this kind of studio model. Like, you could say that cities all around the world have their kind of innovation hubs, which are places for multi-dimensional, synthetic, creative, startup opportunities. So in this particular moment, we have this kind of paradox. On the one hand, the world outside is considerably weirder and more experimental than the world inside. And yet there's a big part of the world outside that's trying to bring our culture, our studio culture, to be a sort of organizing paradigm for cities. So when, for example, students go with their faculty outside into the world, they might meet these two things. They might meet a kind of mirror image, like, cities are thinking of themselves as architectural studios on the one side, and if that's the case, what's happening in those studios, those kind of worldly studios, is considerably more wild than what would be considered plausible within a school of architecture. And I think that creates a fascinating sort of dilemma, dynamic opportunity for educational. So in that sense, I love your kind of call for anti-realism or magic realism and speculation, and the idea of disruptive technology. Here the disruption, though, might be to, as it were, disrupt even our own kind of cozy idea of what studio is. So I think that there is, and so this is just to begin with a question to you. That, I mean, given how beautiful the studios are at the AA, and they are, it's very different from here. For those of you who don't know, here in theory, I mean, I'm a theorist, that's all I can do. In theory, there ain't no religion here. Like, so you can be a member of a sect, but only for 3 months. And even then you sort of disown your teacher. I mean, you don't shave your head or anything, because you're going to be out of that studio within 3 months. And you're doing 3 or 4 or 5 other experiments at the same time with different teachers in different environments. And even if you love the teacher of the studio you're in, you're not going to choose them again, right? That's this place, like anti-sectarian, anti-religion. Whereas within the AA, maybe I'm wrong about this, quite the opposite. You have a series of many possible hypothetical religions that you join for like 5 years, and you really might as well shave your head because, you know, you're going to, or it'll be shaved for you. In both cases, absolutely astonishing work is produced. I mean, at the AA, within the thinking of the unit, and I kind of love the idea of a unit, like a military unit, but this is like magic realism unit. You know, it's like those psychedelic films of the 60s. Depending on which room you go into, you find yourself in another. And the AA is definitely like that. If you make a wrong turn, you're definitely in the wrong place, or you just, somebody says, "Are you sure you should be here?" It's like being in the wrong part of a city. And here, students assemble a series of sort of staccato experiences to produce a sort of collage which may or may not represent a kind of personal position by what they've chosen and so on. These two models, which I love the differences and the connections. But I suppose the question is, slowly, like, do we need to now disrupt that model? Right, like, so at Columbia it seems to me the question would be, you know, like, should we really start to reorganize this studio fantasy, which has now become a school fantasy, not just the architecture program, but is every part of the school is now hypothetically in one big studio in which many different experiments have been carried out. Do you feel like a little bit of an itch that, let's say, as it were, our core business, like the thing that we do better than maybe anyone else, might be getting past its expiration date? Or have you already subverted the...
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the very success of our two quite different models, for me, suggests that tweaking with either isn't really the project. In fact, you could kind of flip the one into the other, and I think we would just carry on. For cultural, historical reasons, within each institution, the model is quite different.
Right.
What we share, though, interestingly, is alongside a very clearly defined pedagogical model, let's say the cult model of the unit system.
Wow.
Appropriately
Additional authority. Just like
exactly. No, I have something to say. Oh my God. I thought I was just talking to him. No. Okay, so let's say the sampling model, which you guys do brilliantly, and it isn't just sampling, but a chance to actually form the project within a student's career through its contact with very different figures, which is a brilliant kind of experiment. And on the other, let's say, a model that for the most part embeds an individual into at least a year-long and usually multi-year-long encounters with one personality, which is as ingrained in our institution as yours is here. And to give you an example, when my fifth-year tutor found out I was working secretly to pay for my fees at the AA for another diploma tutor, he tried to throw me out of the unit because he said it would contaminate the work of Diploma Unit X. And he was totally dead serious. I mean, we weren't allowed to go to other juries at the time, et cetera, et cetera. So, but with those differences, I've never been tempted with tweaking the one towards the other at all, because each proves that that's just part of the legacy of the institution. What we share, actually, that I find most interesting, that I think you had the same instinct as I did, is to wrap around that pedagogical model layers of other activities that in fact are the real means for disrupting the stability of that pedagogy. So what we call in London the public program, which brings in roughly 200 visitors from around the world every year to public audiences that you just sort of throw in front of everyone every day of the year, is one means of doing that. And you all obviously do that here. Our book project, like yours, isn't about promoting the work of a school to an outside world. It's about carrying forward the project of making audiences in different forms. It just becomes another of the means for doing that. I think that's where the game really is today. And at least in our school, to touch on the sort of deep history that Mark offered for this building, what's interesting about the AA is that when it's formed in the 1840s, within the first great wave of industrialization in Europe. This is exactly the moment in the 1840s when towns and the countryside are being converted into factories and mills, and they were the Dubai of their time.
Right.
And the only point I'd probably take in your description is the world was as weird then compared to a school as it is now, just in different forms. But what was interesting is that for me is one of the real contexts for the forming of the idea of an architectural school, that in fact it's being brought in as part of that complex project of not just urbanization but also industrialization of modern life. And I think that's something we've been battling, interestingly, from our very beginnings. The first great speaker at the AA in the early 1850s, weirdly, is John Ruskin, whose project within that generation of English artists was deliberately the rejection of this, what he called the railroadification of the English countryside. I mean, his great figures, Turner, those artists who instinctively saw the destruction of the world they knew, formed a project that tried to provide, to question or interrogate this thing that the modern profession, which is being founded at the very same time, is embracing. The RIBA and the AA are founded together within a few years of one another. They literally live in the same building until 1917, when we jump out and move into Bedford Square. And just as this school has done with the AA, we've evolved alongside that modern profession with increasingly distant, antagonistic, relationships. But more importantly, have to confront industrialization not for the first time today, and it's a sweeping scale of industrialization that's taking place, but really is in a very similar form that gave original force to even the creation of a school like ours. Right. And all we're witnessing today is industrialization at a spectacularly complex level compared to the mechanization in the 19th century. But that for me is the argument for why schools need to dramatically rethink what they're doing. I really love the comments on the role of this studio, and I think in a way this school, as much as any in the country right now, in the U.S., would be convincing universities to the importance of the model of the studio in the production of knowledge. That's something that throughout the 20th century was incredibly troubling to most universities. Studios cost a lot of money. They do weird stuff that can't possibly be equated with what other faculties do, but for exactly the points Mark is making, that model is now being adopted openly by many disciplines, creative fields, and in that way, you're sort of winning the battle with your research university homes for why that is one of the most valuable faculties on the campus.
It's not so well known, but Richard, the guy with the implausible name of Richard Florida, who makes his living by marketing the idea of the creative economy, is a graduate of the school. So the school hasn't really accepted this relationship. But in a way, the relationship is sort of coming home to roost. I sometimes think that as I look at the students who just get better and better, from my perspective, get better and better every year, I think the idea of spending 3 months with one set of colleagues and one teacher on a studio project will very quickly not satisfy students. If I look at the sort of trajectory of capacity, intelligence, and so on, application, techniques of students, I just don't think that they will be that interested to spend an entire 3 months with one studio. So I think it's much more likely that in the relatively near future, in a school like this, students would be at any one time working on 5 or 6 different studio projects, with multiple forms of collaboration involved, sometimes working with colleagues within the school that are much more senior, sometimes much more junior, and kind of organizing their time and doing multiple kind of reviews. I just think we are probably very close to the end of the model of the kind of sort of studio
semester.
To get to that point, administratively it wouldn't be difficult to engineer. Spatially it would be the same. You wouldn't be sitting in your studio. You'd be sitting in a kind of production environment in which you were working on multiple things. But also what you're working on may include the so-called history, theory, technology, and all those sorts of things that might not be any more vastly differentiated. Or history and theory might be, for example, tactically right there in the mix of studio work. I mean, I think we're only well, it's funny that you measure time in terms of deans. You know, like how far down the track is that? I don't think it's very far down the track. The other thing I was thinking a little bit recently is that one of the consequences of what you're describing, and I agree that, I mean, I remember having an alumni breakfast with some of the graduates of the school in Shanghai, and one of them, it was really unclear to me that he'd begun shaving yet. I mean, really he had that, you know, beautiful innocence about him. He was sort of like, you had the feeling like if the wind would blow, he would be sort of carried out of the room, or you'd have to hold him down. Anyway, was totally a sweet guy. And then I foolishly sort of said, well, what are you going to do after you leave breakfast? Like, just because that was a way of finding out what they were going to do. And then when I got to him, he said, well, I have to go and finish my city. And, and I said, you're doing a city? And he said, yeah, well, it's the second one. I mean, he had graduated like 3 months before. And so you're right. The problem is not like, will I get a job, but what will that job be possible? So one possibility is to sort of reverse engineer what you're saying. One of the curious things about that is certain, let's say, old-fashioned ambitions might become thoroughly exciting. Like, you know, having sort of spent years being bored by people looking for a return of public space, with a kind of nostalgic belief that there used to be a space in which people could express themselves, etc., etc., and knowing that the space that they talked about was a space for men and men of a certain social position. It was not really a public space, but an elite, highly constructed and controlled space. So having years of telling our friends that this, you know, fantasy of Habermas and others was about as reactionary as we can get. And then being totally excited by the deployment of an image of public space in the Arab Spring and so on. It occurs to me that certain sort of discredited goals start to become very, very radical. So, for example, just to give a thought, the concept of public space could be thought of as inherently utopian. That is to say, it's not just that there never was this agora dreamed of by Habermas and the crew. There's never been that, but it has been always a kind of...
But it's had a role, it
has been a belief, So you could, if you say to students or to a school, to a university, let's try to work on public space, the creation of public space, because by the way, I don't think that public space is a space in which the public act. Public space is a series of actions that retroactively produce the sense that there is a space and that it might be occupied by so-called public. In other words, it's a series of actions. One could initiate studios and so on that are around a series of actions designed, as it were, aimed at public space. And that would be, in my view, a kind of magic realist act, because there is no such like thing, but there is the dream of this thing. And so it would be a kind of anti-move. So this is what I love about you rebuilding the domino, of course, is that certain like old stories, you know, if you allow the clock to tick long enough, become, and I suppose that's the point of REM with the fundamentals and all of that, that there is a moment in which the beginning becomes more exciting than the old end. But I don't know, I could go on, but I just have this feeling like, you know, you can, part of the reality of urban life is a series of fantasies, you know, a kind of magic reality fantasies. So in this moment in which actually schools might be entirely screwed, like it might be that if the world is weirder than us on the one hand, and the world has anyway ripped us off and is using our studio philosophy as its kind of core business model, we might have run out of moves at that point. Except that the city itself is such a dense, experimental space that one could then, as it were, accept real commissions in the so-called real world, which actually are real as sort of by virtue of images and so on. And I was struck by your comment you made, which I agree with, that architects don't make real things. So in other words, one could go into the real world producing a non-real thing that is actually demanded by the real world for its own purposes. I was just kind of wanting to sort of invite you to say a bit more about that.
It's funny, because as you were talking about it, I was thinking you could, it's almost as if I was overemphasizing our production of new realities, and not at times what amounts to a project almost of the collection of those, and the retention of those. In fact, that you know, if one goes back into the monastic origins of the university, as we know at your research university, which you know we've done a session on the topic of the monastery. We did it a few years ago in a monastery in Spain.
That's true.
Which was a school 500 years ago, and one of the first outposts in which many of the forms of modern knowledge first emerge. And you know, one of the interesting features of monasteries is that they're never singular. They're outposts to a larger distribution. In fact, things were produced in those monasteries that would then travel between. But that monastic origin of the modern university is also not just a place of production, but also a retention of that material, the creation of the first libraries that hold these things. It's no coincidence that this building sits on top of an incredible archive of failed futures. And not just distinguished careers. You know, and the finding of ways to unlock those materials, not just for a generation of architects today, and I think archives are an incredible site of disruption, potentially, because we've all forgotten about them for so long, but that our job is finding ways to make those sorts of spaces and spaces like this room more accessible is what does still, I think, put schools in an incredibly unique position. It's a fine line. I think it's very easy from this view of the room to say, well, you know, and knowing schools as well as we do, to just sort of feel like schools are in charge of everything. The studio is a great model. Look, other people are taking it. Even cities are using it. But of course, if you're a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. I mean, you know, it's easy to overvalue that. I think to step away from the studio model entirely is to then maybe just to turn to the institution itself of the school as we know it. The school as an entity is obviously much more than just the physical repository. It's now the outpost that you have a Studio X, or we do in all of the various visiting programs around the world. It's the archives that sit within. It's all of the online media. It's the publications. It's all of those things are I think the larger definition of what the school has become in the best sense today. And I don't think that's under threat at all. I find almost the opposite to be the case. As you were talking about the model of of students here moving between schools and maybe getting to a point where you'd want less time and more contact, you know, I was sort of imagining that as an extreme version of what you're doing now. The extreme version for us to move in the other direction would be to sign up for a studio and never leave it. Like you have it for a few years in school, you have to come back every few years and rejoin the, you know, you could imagine the sort of extreme sort of acceleration of each of those models. But I think whatever happens with that model of learning, the one thing that does make schools incredibly unique today is that they're one of the few spaces in architectural culture that has as its job the creation of audiences. Right? And the ways in which audiences are being formed today are changing as quickly as all the various technology and media that people are using for that. And I think that's really the thing that will probably disrupt the learning models as much as anything. Right,
and you actually made this sort of amazing claim that the dominant technology of architectural discourse are the schools.
Yeah.
And I do think
there is terrible. Isn't that like self-fulfilling?
I'm interested. I mean, it could come from the narcissism of our assigned jobs, but there are at any one time around about 1 million students of architecture on the planet. So that would in the past have been considered a medium-sized industrial city, you know, with a serious capacity. It's not clear that we use this capacity of 1 million students and in most cases they have amazing teachers. I mean, it's rare. I think it's rare to find an architectural teacher that's not in some way inspiring and dedicated. And I can guarantee they're all underpaid and overworking and dreaming and always thinking that the next class will be like the next project. So it's an amazing, and all the students are heroically romantic in deciding to be, you know, architects. And so you have this amazing group of teachers, an amazing group of students, and I don't think we use that 1 million people effectively in addressing real problems. So in some ways, schools of architecture, 99.99%, are filled with really interesting people, but that I've noticed that when you put interesting people together, they get less interesting the more people, you know, each and every member of faculty I know is progressive, interesting, radical, and so on. Then you make them into a group of 3, and they start to defend certain, you know, key, interesting. You get to 5. So they become more and more conservative the larger the group. It's a kind of a mathematics. So universities are entirely filled with radical teachers, which in combination form an enormously conservative body.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then we end up with these 1 million amazing 1 million amazing students being taught by, you know, whatever, 20th of that, of extraordinary teachers who collectively are very conservative and try to make sure architecture is still architecture, whatever that is. And since nobody knows what it is, we have to do a lot of synchronization, make sure we're all singing the same song. Right? So there's all this sort of going on. And we are one of the most beautifully networked disciplines. I mean, something can go on in an architectural studio in New Zealand, and I can tell you New Zealand is as far away from here as you could think. Nevertheless, if somebody does something in that studio, it'll be instantly, you know, in the social media and figured out. But mainly we keep an eye on each other to make sure nothing's happening, or if something's happening, we should all do it, you know, together. We should all enjoy the same silly Beyonce thing, you know, where we go. So we have a field that's sort of nervous about its place in society, which is weird because society is increasingly thinking of itself as being architectural, as being all about design, creativity. You know, the architectural metaphor is like dominant in the way cities think. But we nevertheless are sort of nervously hunkering down, making sure we still survive. And it's a bizarre situation.
You're making me nervous.
So, you know, either we kind of burst out into the world and say, hey, we fit in so perfectly, and, you know, sing in harmony with the market, or, and I think much more interestingly, your call for architectural schools to operate as a disruptive technology. And then I think it's a question of, like, what are the forms of disruption that are really useful? Yeah. And I can't help but confess one more time my addiction to Marshall McLuhan's idea of the anti-environment from the mid-60s, which is essentially the kind of classical image of the artist as the person who produces an object which resists the environment in some way, and therefore exposes the environment for the first time. And so then the sort of, as it were, task of an architecture school is to give everybody a chance, as best a chance as possible, to produce things in this weird world we live in that show that weirdness, make that weirdness, as it were, visible through this kind of through an anti-environment.
So the question becomes how? How does the school do that?
Right. Given this topography that you're.
I mean, I completely share.
Right.
And for me, the only means seems to be to try and slow time down, to actually let students and teachers have the time you all need for these projects to emerge, and to do that in today's environment of rampant acceleration. The clock is only ever going faster. Means to deliberately just take the time. Right? I mean, to give it...
To slow down.
Yeah. I mean, to try and find a way. When we set up the DRL, now I guess it's probably 14 or 15 years ago, that we model it on the unit system, but we said a year wasn't enough. We wanted a year and a half or 2 years or two and a half for one project. Students were outraged at the thought of having to spend all of that time on a single project, but the argument we were making at the time was that the learning just needs that space. And with careers moving with the kind of speed, you know, and I could tell similar anecdotes of teachers and students dealing with exactly these kind of projects at the speed they are today, that the chance to stand back from that for some moment in your life, I think, is one of the great assets we might offer as a school. Right? Because we can define the rules of engagement. We have that, at least that autonomy left for the most part. And we construct it with different goals or different models in mind, but nonetheless the setting of how time passes within a learning environment is something for us to use, I think, as the way to try and answer that question of how you give people the opportunity to invent models that might disrupt the world as already known or being thought about.
I mean, I mean, as I'm talking, I keep thinking about David Benjamin because I in this sense that, I mean, if the Studio X was the idea to turn the school inside out, that is to say, put our laboratory spaces, the studios, in this world that you were describing, just to see what happens. No particular, certainly not a missionary mission, but to allow the school to take a position, to take positions about the world. It seems to me you can't do that from inside the monastery. Although inside the monastery is great for so many ways, but you also need to be taking a stand or listening, learning, acting, but have each student and faculty to have the opportunity to do that as it were in the world. But the experiment that follows that, which David is launching, is to see what happens if this experimental culture of the school does participate directly in the kind of incubation ecology. That is to say, I've often thought of the school here as being kind of pre-startup, on the assumption, I don't have any special knowledge about this, but I think for a startup to be a startup, it has to be agreed that it's an idea, so that an angel investor can then descend. We operate as a pre-startup. In other words, it's never clear whether what's happening in here is an idea or not. But we, up to this point, have never actually pushed that ideas generation capacity towards the world which would say that's a good idea or not. So I feel like students and faculty have been deprived the opportunity of just, as it were, continuing with the idea, or continuing to see if it becomes an idea, and have instead learned this amazing thing and develop these extraordinary capacities, and then kind of go like, let me get into that architectural world, and leaving out, let's say, all those potentials in between. So David's kind of curating an experiment of literally kind of getting into that world, and I was very curious about whether you guys are up to tricks like that. I don't know if this is a military industrial secret, but
yes,
but
no.
Are you curious?
No,
about
very interested in it. I think for me the most interesting year in architectural school, and this comes from personal experience. I dropped out of 3 schools before getting to the AA, and it is the year after school. It's actually one of the most interesting projects, and I do think it's been a conversation in London for the last couple of years with us trying to imagine the platforms we can set up that become the springboard between an agenda that might sit in a student's portfolio for 1 or 2 or 3 years, which we, like you, wouldn't possibly want them to leave behind as they now go out and start this thing called a career. Right. I mean, we all imagine those careers are starting now with you in this room in various ways, right? For the school to be most interesting to you all. But that year after school is just, the traumatic one, where no longer is the infrastructure or the institutional network, all of that stuff in place. And that's actually where an awfully lot of the architectural universe sorts itself out in that year or two, in interesting ways to me. And I think there's a way in which that expanded sphere of the school isn't just a geographic one, but also a temporal one, and can imagine. We're starting a program this year for school-age children in architecture. So at the other end of that spectrum, what happens in a world where you don't teach architecture at anything but a university level? It's a very peculiar, extremely, particularly in the UK, brutal kind of reality. There's no arts taught at all for a population, and so we're deliberately targeting 8 to 11-year-olds. Wow. It's called the Little Architect. That's
so dangerous. You know, there's no cure for architecture. You're infecting these kids with
just starting at that end, and then after graduation life, what do you all do other than become the young teachers that some of you will and go off and start doing the projects you do? How can there be a sort of learning platform out there for students to engage? Right. And it might be one that the students end up having, or graduates end up having to create. But and again, the model for that is the 19th century. Before the modern profession is in place, there are all kind of incredibly interesting examples of things like the Architectural Association, when it was literally just an association. Before we launched as a school, we're a nighttime club where people would come together and work around books or studios, and there wasn't any formal coursework. There wasn't the modern curricular demands of the profession, etc. And as we confront this new wave of industrialization in the early 21st century, what I find most interesting are probably the ways in which knowledge sits in how architecture negotiated industrialization in the 1850s to 1870s, particularly in Europe, where all of exactly these kind of problems sat, right, before the 20th century model hardens to what it does.
Yeah, it's just it's a thought, I suppose. If if you take the inside of the monastery, which also implies the fragility of the monks, like you've been protected in a way. So if you put these sort of fragile creatures, brilliant fragile creatures with their weird costumes into the world, of course then the world also comes back into the monastery. And this other experiment about incubation is more like just sliding through the perforated limits of the university into that sort of ecosystem. And I'm very interested. I think that, for example, a university could react to the current situation in at least two ways. One would be to say, we're finished. We are going to be like the newspapers. Yeah. It's going to hit us overnight. We're going to wake up. And it's all over.
Neil Gershenfeld's is MIT obsolete.
People will still keep pouring in. Yeah. I mean, it could be 100 years goes by before anybody realizes. I mean, you and I know schools of architecture that feel very good about themselves, and they do so strongly that they don't do any interesting work because that would sort of interfere with their good feeling. But the people in those schools, and there are many of them, all feel like they're really doing important stuff. It's just that there's a sort of, again, a sort of dream world has developed. So a university could maintain a similar dream world. For 100 years or so, there still could be this sort of myth of the magical university with all its sort of extraordinary, important experiences. Over time, some scholars may discover that during the time that all the students were there, really it was something in the cell phone or whatever that was really the basis of the connectivity, and there are lots of people who didn't go to the research universities that were actually just as brilliant, and they were actually hiring the people who went to the universities and this sort of thing. So I think it could take 100 years for the university to sort of suddenly, realize that it's all gone. But there's another view which would be to say, what's kind of going on in the world is what the university has always really treasured and has been expert at. In other words, it's just that the idea of university has been inverted. The reflection happens now in the middle of action in the world. So actually, this is our time. Like, this is the time. So a kind of new university is born now, and I do think that conversation will go over the next 20 years or so, and it'll go really fast. And I'm kind of really curious what happens to architecture schools during that time. But I feel like we should invite the audience to
give us the hard questions.
Join us or shoot us or
come drinking with us.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Questions? Because you can see we will go on for hours.
Yeah.
Some water.
Yeah. Thank you both for this. Just to touch right on what you're saying now, I can't help thinking of the university and its traditional role, at least in what we know today, as it's traditional, I guess, but I don't know if it was before, where a brilliant project starts in a university and suddenly, the university now foments a new revolution like a Google or, a sort of these new processes where the university is no longer just you're in or you're out, but it's sort of with the university, right? So even, Zuckerberg getting out of Harvard, it's part of the narrative, and it doesn't happen without, what he did there. So I'm wondering, though, does that mean that whatever's next is sort of the further breakdown of a clear role of the university? Or are you suggesting that sort of as the university gets further away from its sort of core, it becomes more capable of doing that sort of thing, which we now, we now understand its potential to do? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know. I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, I actually really like. I don't like people that like the place that they are, just as a rule. But unfortunately,
But he loves this place.
But I like this place. I particularly like Columbia, right? So this invalidates anything I'm about to say. Imagine I'm now like talking about my family or my children. Actually, if I talk about my family, it could get quite grim. So not talking about your parents, but talking about your children. you speak with such love and admiration and also bewilderment at the miracle of it all. I feel a little bit like that about Columbia, right? In that weird way, the place that you are in becomes like your child. You care about it a lot. So the great thing of Columbia, I think, to try to rationalize this emotion that I have, is it's Columbia University in the city of New York. So it's a university that takes as its definition urbanity. So it's yes, the monastery idea, but the monastery in the city, which is like having your cell phone on the subway. It's a combination of withdrawal and engagement. It's this brilliant vibration, which was beautifully defined by this campus. And of course, this is the great immigrant city. So it is to be in what has been an incubator. Manhattan has been an incubator for the world for a long time, and still is that. It still is. So basically, this is a university that floats in an island, which is an incubator, a global incubator. Not by chance, it's one of the few universities that believes that it will evolve and believes that it will change, and this kind of global, the way it's thinking globally is about acknowledging that there will be a whole other form of the university. I believe very deeply that universities need to have a future. That is to say, they need to design it, construct it, visualize it, envision it, politic for it, act on it. And I take the current statistics of so many people wanting to get into universities as a sign that universities are no longer in any way controversial, which is the moment in which they could become extinct. So something you said resonated for me, which is, of course, this is also the university most associated with the idea of a core. So I don't think those things are incompatible. I think you can be really dedicated to a place and to the core, while especially if you think of a radioactive core as a kind of flipping out to a much bigger scale. So I really do think that if you're hanging around Columbia, and for those of you who are students here, you actually end up hanging around Columbia your whole life, because in your formation, it's really some sort of ship that's on some sort of journey, and it's very easy to notice which universities are setting off on a journey like this, and it's a very small number. So if you're going to buy a ticket and be in one of these ships, this is a good one to be in. There are a bunch of other universities that believe that they should just keep expanding because they're really amazing and wonderful in every possible way. And what they're doing is basically those universities are sort of slowly turning into not very interesting cities. Because universities are big, really big. So they're just becoming sort of suburban conglomerations. So I think here, where you have already the urban established, you have a much more interesting potential. I know that's a long answer to your question, but a kind of revolution will happen to the concept of the university if the university sees itself as a stupidity reduction machine, which Columbia does. So by definition, and this is something I learned from Cedric Price. I mean, he once told me his main mission in life was to reduce the level of his ignorance. It was not to have a great idea, but just to be less stupid. So if Columbia continues to want to be less stupid, which it does, it's going to evolve. And I think that's interesting. That's why, by the way, I think it has always been very important at Columbia that our sports teams lose. I'm very, very frightened about athletic success. Sorry about that.
Just one last, I'm not going to say anything to that question, but this discussion around the relationship of the university and the city, I couldn't help but think of the only extant architectural drawing on the planet in a 700-year period between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. The floor plan of St. Gallen, the monastery in St. Gallen, which is in effect the model for how to design a city. Before the Renaissance rediscovers that medieval impulse in the return to the only text from antiquity, the university is conceived as this domain that is a small city, right? That it's not just a place within a city, but the convergence of the two concepts, lies in the very history of architecture, right? I mean, St. Gallen, that great plan of all those buildings and the institutions. I mean, I know nothing about universities, so I can't
Yep,
help
there's a
with
question
that.
in the middle.
Can you pin down a definition for the ideal function of the public space? And how do you rate the Agora of Low Plaza as a public space?
No to the first question, and 200 out of 100 for the second. Public space, according to the view I would take, they would be multiple. Public spaces would not be fixed, but would be sort of dynamic spaces produced through actions, and the proof of their health would be the actions. So I would imagine an incredible diversity of public spaces. In many ways, the cell phone is performing the function of a public space in the classical definition of spaces of exchange, of comparison, so on. The architecture of this university is quite remarkable because it is one of the few great public spaces of New York. I mean, that's another thing. If you really want to identify the great public spaces, obviously Central Park, but you really the number of spaces that truly capture the imagination in terms of almost encouraging a kind of gathering and a sharing of ideas. One of those is right here. And sometimes a little bit forgotten because it's inside a university. I never met anyone, but maybe it starts to happen, who didn't feel like when they entered the Morningside campus, something elevated, like there was almost the expectation that you would see or hear something. That's an amazing accomplishment. One of the miracles of that accomplishment is that it allows almost all of the buildings around to be pretty bad. So it's an incredible maneuver by the architects to produce a very good building in the middle, low library. As you probably know, only from the steps north was the original campus. Everything south was sports fields, getting back to the sports theme. And very quickly they discovered they needed that. So really it was one beautiful building surrounded by a series of kind of backup singers of not much talent. Because the actual university was a horizontal space. So I think in many ways Columbia is an image of a kind of classical understanding of public space. So when the university says, okay, now what would be the university of the future? The question would be what is the equivalent of that? And the equivalent of that, and I don't have an answer to this, but it seems to me there should be actually many answers. I think the idea that a university as it were, organizes itself around a single public space, this is maybe what needs to change. In other words, there might be a way of thinking of a multiplicity of different ways in which Columbia forms itself, of which the existing Morningside space in front of Low should always be treasured as the... I mean, I'm very much of the view, for what it's worth, that moving towards the future is more about deciding what you want to bring with you than kind of revolution. So in that sense, the Morningside public space can be the anchor or the kind of treasured space within a much wider array. I mean, it's just a thought. When there is the commencement ceremony and there are 40,000 people occupying that space and the full kind of dignity of the institution is there, there are 40,000 cell phones doing selfies and connecting and communicating and exchanging, and there is television broadcasts and radio signals, and so you're not just meeting on Low Plaza, you're at the epicenter of millions of radio signals which are being negotiated with incredible subtlety by teachers, faculty, university, and so on. And some of those spaces actually, in my opinion, have the capacity that we used to associate with that. I mean, as a school, do you work with social media as a kind of medium?
We do. I think is in very much the model you're describing is just another layer on top of the kind of physical spaces that we've been inhabiting now for, we'll be there for 100 years in 2020. 2017 will be 100 years in Bedford Square, and the school has grown up around.
This building is 100 years this year.
Yeah, the centenary issues around architecture right now are fascinating. The sort of extreme old age syndrome that Corb and others couldn't have imagined. But I think for us, it's just another layer. I mean, the one thing that I have, and it's very much a personal view with our school, is the absolute conviction that putting people together in a room is as important as slowing time down right now. And I don't know why that is, and I'm not sure it'll be the case for very much longer, but at least for this era right now, until some of those other technologies take on qualities that they don't seem capable of delivering right now, they're for us just another layer. We have digital platforms team that does nothing but continually broadcast the life of the school to different audiences. And in some of these events, I've shown some of our presentations where 4 or 5 screens are up while a person is presenting work, and everybody's looking in a different part of the room, and people don't even quite know what to do in those kind of spaces now, and it's quite interesting. But what I'm struck by is the role that sitting in rooms together still plays in production and dissemination of knowledge.
Right.
And for that reason, we've sort of backed off any attempt at sort of distant learning or the sort of electronic, online sort of equivalence of enrolling and being in a school like this one or where we are.
Right.
As much as we're sharing with you the setting up of outposts in this year something like 50 or 52 cities, where we'll be working, and all of those are really just attempts for bodies and ideas to move from place to place geographically. Which again, I think is something that as a faculty within a university is an incredibly important thing for Columbia or anyone else to see, is the role architects play in shaping that kind of project.
I mean, I think that also, just getting back to your question, there's another question behind, but I think what I was trying to say before is, for example, asking an architecture school like this to think again about the category public space would be in my opinion, a very important and interesting assignment. Where if maybe even only 10 years ago, it was a kind of nostalgic gesture, a kind of attempt to recover something lost.
Yeah.
I think now you're in a situation in which publics, maybe what you call audiences, are being produced and are self-producing in very multiple ways. And the question is, how can an architecture school
learn from that,
participate?
Yeah.
And also what it means public and what it means space is so different culturally. I mean, paradoxically, one form of public space that could be very important is disconnection. And maybe disconnection done socially. And I think engineering a sort of disconnection from ubiquitous connectivity starts now to be a way of defining a space. I mean,
a different kind of space.
Yeah, I mean, people treat their phones with more affection than they treat each other. You just have to look at the
amount of petting,
the wonderment, So I mean, anyway, another question, just a few, and then we should let you have a life. Yeah.
What do you see the role of the school as in bringing outside bodies in? I know you talked about the school as being this kind of pre-startup idea and like trying to fight this idea of students developing this fabulous set of skills and then taking a hard right turn right after graduation, because even though we kind of promote this idea that we're all ready to make like the next big idea, the moment you get thrown out there, you always are left with this question of who do I talk to about this idea? And so there's always the easy option. You've got your $100,000 of debt, so you take the job that's going to pay you a fixed fee and you slowly pay it off, and you end up kind of all those things you learned slowly atrophy and go away. But I know GSAPP's taken a position where they start bringing in kind of this idea of like corporate sponsors, the Reuters, the Oldcastle, Audi, as these external bodies that aren't necessarily people who would come to an architect first. Kind of ask them, use like the brand of Columbia as a way to like tell them, say, give us your information, trust us, we'll do something interesting with it, and then come back in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and we'll show you something really amazing. Do you see the role of the school as and this idea of the incubator even more so as kind of bringing these external bodies and kind of actually exposing. Because I know we have this idea of kind of finding alternative venues to like talk outwards, but generally these venues tend to be talking to other architects, tend to be talking to the similar audiences who would be, buying Volume magazine. It's not going to be the people who would turn to like, oh, we have a corporate issue, let's turn to McKinsey. They're going to solve all of our problems. Right. In this case, the idea that the architect is equally posed to solve these problems, but the issue is the outside world doesn't realize that we have those capabilities.
Well, in a way, you framed the question more better than I did, and you almost answered it. Seems to me. On the first part, I very much agree with also what Brett was saying before. That time after graduation is particularly rich in in kind of potential. So the question is how to allow the thought processes that have got underway at school and have got underway under very social circumstances to survive when you're kind of called in to be an individual sort of monad in somebody else's game, and to create a kind of transitional space between the school and what your final decisions will be about your path, where you can actually continue some of what you were doing at school, but actually empowered by the fact that you're surrounded by a bunch of equally wonderful people that are also in the same situation. I think that seems to me really, really important and needs to become almost a big part of schools, to think of the afterlife just as much as we think about the life inside. In fact, you could even think of that philosophically. If the head of a school and a faculty just said, let's just think seriously about the 2 years after graduation and do everything to take care of those 2 years, and then reverse engineer to try to have a school adequate to what you have now imagined, I think you end up with a much better school by thinking about those few years. And I think it's great that you go all the way back and corrupt the innocent at the other end. And towards the end of what you were saying, I think, firms like Audi are particularly interesting because they could ask anyone. So in a way, it's interesting when architecture school becomes the kind of advisor of last resort, like when you could ask anybody, like there is a moment when a school where a particular kind of school of architecture is the most likely to offer a mega corporation like Audi the kind of insight it needs. And in the case of Audi, the insight it needs has to do with a sense of their imminent demise. So one of the things I really admire about the president of this university is he speaks as if we must change. That's in every speech, rather than get out the pom-poms. He really says, well, what is it that we would need to do together to make for a better university, but also for a better society, seeing those two things together. Likewise, Audi says, okay, we've got 20, maybe 30 years where we make cars, but we notice there are no cars in the images being produced by architects of what the future is. So if it's not cars, like what's going, so finally they come to us. So I think that's an example of, let's say, a very positive involvement from the outside. A less positive would be, taking advantage of the fact that architects like to be working long hours for almost no money, and a school of architecture can generate a huge amount of ideas for you on a modest budget. There's that goes on. Now, if what they are trying to exploit you with is a question you're really excited about anyway, you don't mind being ripped off and you join in, I think there is another intermediate there, which is actually that ideas coming from the students and faculty are possibly ideas that might be picked up by a wider world. Now, if that wider world wants to sort of make money and all of that, well, then it's great, I think, that students and faculty and so on would participate in that. I don't think it's interesting for the school. In other words, I think if the school gets into the incubation environment and says, and if some of this pays off, the school's going to be fine. I think, no, we actually have to say, this is a space for the students who graduate to be empowered, and if that power means success financially or whatever, that's terrific. And the school has to say again and again and again, we want no part of the financial hook, because I do think that a school like this one, its disconnection from traditional understanding of the economy is a big part of its strength. It's a big part of what we do not to be bought. It doesn't mean we're stupid or naive about money, but I think not being interested in the intellectual property rights, for example, of that environment is a way of saying to the students, it's your property. We did something else. I don't think it's a great answer to your question, but I think in a very short amount of time, that space, the space after graduation, may become the crucial point for education. I noticed that business schools, engineering schools, journalism schools, a number of other schools, typically professional schools, have started to identify that as the point that really interests them. Maybe that's because actually, particularly in the United States, schools are absolutely amazing. So the inside of these schools are phenomenal. So in a certain sense, the core business of a school is going so well that really good schools can say, we don't have to think about that for a while. Let's really look at where whatever hits the road.
Yeah, the consequences of one of the consequences of a knowledge economy being that we all, in effect, remain students forever, right? And your production of knowledge is what will define each and every one of your careers, not the projects you produce, not the buildings, that's stuff that becomes the vehicle for delivering the knowledge, which is where your great value will lie. I think that's why, in effect, the public programs of schools like this are an extension of that that learning model in a different form. It's an opportunity for you to come back to Columbia a year or two later and sit in this room with people that will be far more interesting than Mark or I tonight, presenting ideas and projects that will be your peers, your contemporaries, your antagonists, your enemies, but they are the culture of your own work. And I think that's why, for me, the public program matters to the degree it does. Right. For 100 years at the AA, I and thousands of graduates would inhabit the buildings in Bedford Square for anywhere from 2 to 5 years. I did a 2-year stint, because I came in the final 2 years of a 5-year program. Many people came from year 1 and went to year 5, but until the mid-1990s, that was the extent of the school. When we launched the DRL in 1996-97, the idea of the Design Research Lab was to create a kind of incubation space after undergraduate life, where for those that wanted to could hang around for another year and a half to get an MArch, a master's degree. And what's happened since 1992-93 is that now roughly 45% of all of the students in the AA are in that graduate school. Mm-hmm. They are the demographics that prove the point that architecture is no longer that stable 20th century model of learn for a few years and then you go out and build a career. All of us know, and many of you are in this room because you've been through a certain set of experiences early on, have gained an undergraduate education, or not, maybe worked in offices, run your own studios, nonetheless feel the need to come back to a school like this, tool up a bit further, challenge your own expectations. That same habit is going to carry on next year, the year after you graduate. And that's why I think it's a completely different and interesting space for schools to contemplate what it is they do in a world where that's the reality for all of us, not just students enrolled in a full-time course, but that you'll be doing that between now and your final years of a career.
Picking up on what Brett's saying, it seems to me a very risky proposition to imagine that, in the next generation, education would be something that occupies a distinct phase of your life. I think very, very quickly, and actually part of the work that we've been doing is on trying to understand, as we all live to around about 100 years old, which means an entirely different political dynamic, a different economy, a different social contract, and the university would not be something that you kind of enter and then you leave. It will be a continuous kind of thread of your life, and a kind of confusion of work and education will take place. And that seems sort of obvious. So I think that what you see now is universities sort of expanding, like one of these science fiction movies. Boom, boom, boom. museums expanding, boom, 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 everything sort of expanding.
Yeah, industrializing.
But they will expand in time as well. And so I just think, maybe what you call the kids that you're teaching architecture, they will be, in a way, entering university or whatever at that point. And I think this is not a very risky, to say something like this is not a big risk. Maybe all of this work on those 2 or 3 years after graduation is the beginning of a university stretching itself in time, and I think that would be super exciting. Like if you do a degree at Columbia, you kind of become a member of a club, that you can use whenever you want. Many alums have told me over the years they would love the opportunity 10 or 20 years later to come back and do one semester at the school and kind of rebound and refresh. And they always say this with incredible emotion and conviction, and they would pay to do it. And I think the students that are here would actually it would be incredibly interesting, and if we could add another floor on top of this building, maybe we would do it. But we should be doing it, because that would be the beginning of expanding the relationship with Columbia, and also, narcissistically take advantage of the incredible knowledge that would come back into the school from victims of this place who then were in the world and then come back. I mean, if I was the dean, that's what I would do. So there was a question over here, and then we should stop, right?
The last question, if I read correctly between the lines, it seems like you're in support of a private school model. I might be wrong, I don't know. So I would like you to talk about it a little bit more, also considering maybe the what in Europe, the ambition of Odile Deck that tried or managed to start a new school, and that has been highly criticized as another...
Which one is this, the new school in London, the humanities school?
No, it should be in France. I don't know if I read it correctly. And it's been criticized as another AA that France wouldn't want, since it has like a good
They would never wanted us.
So I wanted to know your idea of what could be the role, if there's the space over it.
Well, let's say one of the unspoken things that these two schools would certainly share is the fact that they are overwhelmingly private and expensive institutions, right? Which frames the question of accessibility, public audience in its own brutal, peculiar ways. That I think in some way we have to both acknowledge and enter into the strategies for how we try and genuinely open the boundaries to institutions that nonetheless cost huge amounts of money to operate and to run the models that we want. The bottom line is my students pay an awfully lot of money to study in London in a full-time program that's very small. These are groups of 8 or 10 or 12 kids working with 2 or 3 tutors throughout an entire year in the middle of the West End of London, et cetera, et cetera. The costs are a huge amount of money comes in every year. We turn that around and spend it on that teaching and learning. But the reality is very few people, even in Western Europe right now, have access to that as a learning space. And I think that's one of the things that threatens to undermine the 19th century model of the academy or the architectural school as we know it, right, as it's founded in Paris. And that's one of the things that for us has been a driver to both the geographic experiments of finding ways where entering into the unit system isn't something that you can only do by joining, gaining admission to a program and having an entire year and paying a year's fees, but by joining into these smaller guerrilla insurgency schools that are running around the world, where for a few £100 over the course of a month or 3 times a year in Brazil or in Argentina or wherever you might be in Chile, you can sit down and for the first time have access to what we would all here take for granted as a sort of studio learning model, this sort of intense, project-driven, agenda-driven sort of teaching. And it's an open question for me in terms of the models that might be out there for schools like mine or maybe here at Columbia to learn from. Again, we're not particularly interested in the stuff that the universities in this country are talking a great deal about right now, sort of massively online curricula, courses, etc. We have all of that. sort of stuff, I suppose, to speculate on in the future. But for me, it's actually finding countermodels to this very hardened 20th century definition of a full-time student in a private academy, which is, yes, the overwhelming majority of our current experience as a school. You know, all 750 students, 250 tutors make up a 1,000-person body that's all modeled on really the 20th century's definition of what a proper architectural education is. You start in October, you do a project till June, you do that for a few years, and you slowly go through stages of qualification. In today's knowledge economy, I think that isn't a model that will be replaced by another smarter one, but it will simply become one channel of many possible avenues for gaining both access and entrance into the discipline or into the field. Other countries, in fact, outside of Europe, outside of England and Europe, have long had in place vocational models that sit alongside the universities, which is something that we're just starting to experiment with. You know, the idea would be on a part-time basis, come in and do something. I launched 2 years ago in London something called the Night School, which is modeled on what the AA was doing in the 1870s and 80s, where people were just coming in after their jobs, day jobs were over as apprentices, and basically filling the space of the school at a time in which all of my full-time students and teachers step away. And again, I think there's more than anything a will today for schools to try and take that project on, and we're still at a stage where all we can do is sort of throw alternative ideas out there right now and see what starts to work and what doesn't. To get around the principal feature that you point to in the question, which is that's a very limited sphere of access and public in terms of how one engages the full-time models it's already defined.
But we should stop. I think it was a great question. I don't really know the answer. I think I do like the AA and this place too, but I wouldn't recommend that they be duplicated. Like I think it would be good to have, for other schools to develop other experimental models. But this is here is also a community of 1,000 people, so it's interesting that the metric, the scale of the operation is similar. But in the 6 Studio X's, I don't know if there is 4,000 or 5,000 people engaged in each of those each year. So the kind of effective community grew enormously to the benefit of the school and so on. So I think it is a highly expensive private institution, and that's a sort of not very admirable kind of political model. And there have to be developed, ways in which that changes how it operates. But, the sort of interactivity and streaming and connection mean that, in fact, the resources are much more horizontally shared. And part of the point of the Studio X is to say it shouldn't just be signals, as it were, coming out of Columbia, going to the world like a kind of military propaganda radio channel, but there should be broadcasts to provide broadcast capacity for young architects and professionals and so on around the world to sort of broadcast back. So the school has now set up a kind of platform that allows this kind of exchange, and in that sense the resources are much more horizontally, intellectual and financial resources are more horizontally distributed, which I don't think is the beginning of world peace and the end of uneven development, but it is like a kickoff in that direction. And I hate the massive online stuff. It's very boring classes. It has some kind of, I didn't want to knock prostitution, but it's a kind of honourable discipline. It is it's being engaged in for the worst of reasons, I think, and I think there will be forms of electronic learning on the other side of that, and some universities will get fatter as a result of their engagement with that. But there are some things that don't go so well in that environment, and those are just not done because they're not good for business, and those tend to coincide with the kinds of things that we do in a School of Architecture. So that doesn't mean that we're offline. It means that we will have other ways of, architecture doesn't really fit very well into something that ends up with a choose the answer from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyway, we've got to go. You've got to go. Just to thank Brett for joining us again.